Here are some Week 9 fantasy football notes. Feel free to pause at any time. 18 targets across the last 2 games for Rondale Moore. He should continue to be a wide receiver 3 or flex play with Hollywood Brown out. Patterson came back to Atlanta, 14 total touches, 2 rushing touchdowns, 18.3 fantasy points. In 3 out of 4 of the games he saw the majority of the snaps, he scored 18 plus. Stephon Diggs looks like the only pass catcher you can trust in Buffalo. He had a down week, but still 14.3 fantasy points. Gabe Davis, Dawson Knox, Isaiah McKenzie, back-to-back weeks of nothing special. Pick up Terrace Marshall, who scored 12.7 last week and then 14.3 fantasy points this week. He is the wide receiver 2 in Carolina. Justin Fields is a must-play quarterback, QB8, QB5, 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 and then the QB1 this week. Season-high 3 passing touchdowns. He also had a career and NFL record regular season 178 rushing yards for a quarterback. Joe Mixon probably won or lost you your matchup depending on if you had him or played him, but he had 4 rushing touchdowns and 1 receiving touchdown, which made Joe Burrow not have to do much in this game. Don't overreact to Amon-Ra St. Brown having a down fantasy week with 9.5 points. He has 19 targets across the last 2 weeks. He continues to be hyper-targeted. With Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson exiting this game, Allen Lazard had a big day. This was his 3rd week of 17-plus fantasy points. He had 10 targets. Dameon Pierce continues to be a safe play just because he's had a ton of volume in that Houston offense. 9 sacks probably doesn't help, but Sam Ehlinger has not been great, which has led to the Indianapolis pass catchers not being great. It was a good matchup for Trevor Lawrence, which meant Christian Kirk had a bounce-back week. It was his 2nd-best fantasy outing with 21.6 fantasy points. The targets are there for him, and on a side note, Travis Etienne was a beast. Mecole Hardman is quietly on a tear right now. He had 19.9 fantasy points after 28 last week, 9 targets in this game. If Keenan Allen or Mike Williams are out of the mix, Joshua Palmer is a must-play. He just had 18.6 fantasy points, 22 targets across the last 2 games he's played. Darrell Henderson, who I think is the best back for the Rams, had the most touches, but it was only 12. It's a weird committee over there. Derek Carr hyper-targeted Devonta Adams for 17 targets for the 2nd time this season. He had a bounce-back game. Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert both scored a touchdown, but I feel like Jeff Wilson might take over this job. 9 targets, 9 catches, and 70 receiving yards. TJ Hockenson had a great debut for the Vikings. 8, 7, and 7 targets for Ramondre Stevenson the last few weeks makes him a great running back play. Around 17 fantasy points for Garrett Wilson the past 2 games shows the Wilson-to-Wilson connection. Huge game for Dallas Goedert. His volume has been pretty consistent even with having 2 solid wide receivers in his mix. Ken Walker had his 2nd-best fantasy performance. Cade Otton is continuing to grow in this Tampa Bay offense. Don't panic sell Robert Woods. They're not throwing the ball a ton with Malik Willis. Tannehill should be back. Quiet game for Terry McLaurin, but his volume has been consistent the last 3 games.